Okay. The four immeasurable minds. These are these lovely colored squares before you, also known as the Brahmi Viharas. They are immeasurable because if you practice them every day, your heart expands to embrace the whole world. So out of your cup, it's overflowing and expanding, and it ripples out to all those around you, this sense of presence, this sense of happiness, joy, compassion, and equanimity or inclusiveness and loving kindness. Now, these are considered the four aspects of true love, the very nature of an enlightened being. Now, when we say true love, it's because love is a very vague word. When I ask somebody what love is, what it means to them, everybody tends to have sort of a different response. There's some overlap, some similarities, but not everyone can quite agree exactly what love is. Now, in this practice, we consider the four immeasurables to make up what love is, these four elements. So we call this true love because in this practice, this is the truest form that love can take. So let's talk about some of the differences of what true love is versus love that someone might consider to be love, but not actually love. So sometimes love can entail, for some people, more of like expectations, preferences for things, preferences of a person. So we hold this vision of our partner. So we have a certain idea of the type of person that they're supposed to become, and we try to change them or force them in some capacity to try to fit that image. It's like trying to take a triangle peg and fit into a square hole, and it just doesn't quite fit. So it's not recognizing that everybody's a little different, they're on their own journeys, and they're not going to fit your image of how things ought to be or should be, and all of the preferences that you have. So instead, when we talk about true love, we are expanding the heart and creating space for the type of person that they are in that moment, and not overlaying our expectations of them onto that person. So can our hearts become expansive and big enough to make space for the type of person they are without trying to change them in any way? These elements of true love are meant to heal the illnesses that are born from hatred, anger, loneliness, and sadness. And when we try to grasp on to a certain idea or a preference or a should or should nots, oftentimes that grasping leads to hatred or anger because we're not getting what we want, or the loneliness and sadness because it just never quite seems like this we can find that person who's quote unquote right for us because they're not fulfilling those expectations. And so I know of people who simply drift through life, not finding a friend or a partner who matches what they think they ought to have. And this breeds loneliness, some sadness, disappointment. We can often find ourselves adrift in the world, feeling like nobody cares, that people don't care about us, and that we are meaningless, and that we don't have value. You might see this in parent to children dynamics, where we have these expectations that parents lay on top of us as children and expect us to fulfill those as we grow older. And this can lead to all sorts of ill feelings, like the ones I just mentioned. The loneliness and sadness born from never seeming to fulfill those expectations of our parents. So with Maitri, this is a Sanskrit word, and the root of it means friend. So friendship is the foundation for love to blossom. Many of us know this. Although sometimes people tend to want to just jump towards that euphoric feeling that comes with quote unquote love, most often just lust. But for love to actually occur, true love, we have to start with a foundation of friendship. And so that entails getting to know each other, understanding each other, asking questions, becoming curious about a person. Otherwise, how can you truly love them if you don't know them? Learning how to make time and show up for people. This is about quality time. I know for me, when I talk about love languages with people, quality time is a big one. I'm not talking about just in romantic relationships, but also in friendships. Being able to make time for people and then showing up for them. There's nothing more disappointing for me than when people don't show up when they say they're going to show up. Now, granted, there's always exceptions. People have things happening, might be a flat tire, what have you. But integrity is huge for me. And that could be considered like an expectation, but I also want to acknowledge that if I'm going to invite people in my life and make time for them, I expect them to also show up for me. So we have certain boundaries that we sometimes place, right? We must practice looking and listening deeply so that we know what to do and what not to do to bring happiness to others. So again, this involves deep conversation with people, asking the right questions. Ty relates this to a story about a student bringing Ty a durian fruit as a gift, and Ty accepted the gift, but he wasn't the most happy about it because he was not a fan of durian fruit at all, right? So a person could have the intentions of doing good or trying to please another, but because you don't understand that person fully, you might actually cause more harm than good, right? So this is why understanding is very, very key for true love to actually occur in a relationship. Trying to understand the needs, aspirations, and sufferings of the one you love. And again, not just in a romantic relationship, but also understanding that when a person might react in a certain way towards you, it could be stemming from past trauma. I've triggered many people and upset them, and I had zero idea why. And it took me actually having to have a conversation with them afterwards and say, hey, what went wrong here? I feel like I might have upset you. Help me understand where I went wrong. Is it about me or is it something else? I remember watching a conversation between two people in a seminar, and the guy who was leading the seminar seemed to upset somebody in the audience, and the audience member stood up and said that, he was being oppressive and radiating toxic masculinity. And the leader of the seminar turned to her and said, we asked her, who do I remind you of? I thought that was a really interesting question to ask because sometimes when we trigger somebody, we might remind them of somebody from their past. And so getting to understand somebody so that we don't, we do our best to not trigger them and that trauma so that it helps the relationship blossom. Because everybody is just a little different. Everybody is carrying some sort of story in their lives. And so hearing them out and listening to that story, we get a better idea of how to navigate that relationship with that person. And we have to try our best not to possess our beloved in order to fulfill a craving. This goes back to what I mentioned earlier about trying to grasp onto a certain craving that we might have and wanting that person to fulfill that craving when it's not something that they're interested in doing for a variety of reasons, right? And then we might get offended and think, well, this person's not fulfilling what I want, so they must not care about me. Now, this is not true love, right? So we have to be able to love this person enough to give them the freedom to be who they are at the time. So can we make space for that? Sometimes you'd be surprised. You might find that what it is that you're looking for, you might find in other ways. I've been going through this book on the 8 Rules of Love from Jay Shetty. I'm not a huge fan of Jay Shetty, but I do appreciate this book for its emphasis in the very first chapter on the importance of aloneness and learning to love yourself first before trying to seek any type of love externally. So when you start with loving yourself first, you might actually find that you fulfill certain cravings that you might have or wants or desires simply by turning inward and finding that in yourself. Or that craving might disappear altogether. Maybe you have certain friends in your life that fulfill some of your needs better than maybe your partner can, right? There's too much reliance these days on our partner to fulfill all of our needs. See how you can fulfill that for yourself. Maybe your friends can assist you and support you in certain ways that your partner isn't capable of. And karuna is the humane quality of understanding the suffering of others and wanting to do something about it. Right? So understanding the suffering of others, that's sympathy. When you feel what other people feel, like there's a sadness in a person and you're also kind of taking on that sadness, you kind of feel it within your own body, that's empathy. But the action of wanting to relieve that suffering in the other person is compassion, karuna. But to be able to relieve that suffering in the most skillful way possible, you have to be able to understand the nature and origin of their pain and sorrow, your pain and sorrow. Because when you understand your own history and you've done the inner work, perhaps you've seen a therapist who has guided you in navigating that history of pain. Once you understand your own pain and been able to work through that, practicing forgiveness, self-love, that understanding that comes from that insight will leak outward through compassion towards the suffering of others. And I'm not just talking about people that you care about, but also people who have opposing views to your own. Because when you see people who might get wrapped up in a certain ideology or a belief and they can't seem to escape it or think outside of it. Maybe relate that to your own life. What were some times where you had a difficult time letting go of your own beliefs and the anger that rose up within you because of it, right? And then extending that compassion to the other person and finding the appropriate means to try to ease their distress. Find the means to reach out with your heart and try to be vulnerable with them. For some people, this can be a little scary. Like, why would I want to open up myself to somebody who's angry or throwing a fit or could be potentially harmful towards me? But when we let down the walls that we've built up throughout our lives and we try to touch vulnerability, sometimes that helps the other person to step back from being so defensive. Right? So sometimes we just have to be the example for them. Because when both people are being prickly towards each other, that just keeps the cycle going, where it just builds and builds and builds, and people start doing harmful things to each other. And it's like the mass destruction theory, where it's like when one country starts building up their arsenal of nuclear warheads, then uh, another country might start building up their own, and it keeps going and it keeps going until they have thousands of nuclear warheads just aimed at each other's soil, right? And it's like there's just no end to it. So at some point, we have to be able to step back from that cycle and saying, okay, how can we reconcile this conflict appropriately? And vulnerability is a way to do that. One skillfully placed word or action can be enough to give comfort, to help avoid a mistake that you might make or the other person might make, or even change the course of our lives entirely. You never know. Deep understanding can even bring love to those who have done us harm. Care for them without expecting anything in return. So compassion can be a gateway towards forgiveness. Forgiveness, not in the sense that we're telling a person that, you're off the hook. What you did, whatever. It's not a big deal, right? We aren't saying that when we talk about forgiveness. But forgiveness in the sense that we're not allowing that harm from the past live rent-free in our own minds and taking on the power back rather than sitting in the seat of the victim and living in fear of that pain repeating itself in the future. Forgiveness allows us to move past that and take our power back so we don't have to live in fear. Despite all the suffering in the world, the Buddha smiles because he knows how to take care of it and transform it. I had a thought of this was actually from a video game called Ghosts of Tsushima. And there's this wooden temple that has a big golden Buddha statue in the center of it. And then the Mongolians invade and they burn the temple down to the ground. And there's rubble and ash everywhere, but the golden Buddha statue is still there. It's still there amongst all of this destruction, and it still has a slight smile to his face. And that gave me pause. I thought how interesting that was. That even amongst all of this chaos and this war and this pain, the Buddha still sits there with that slight smile on his face because he knows how to take care of the suffering within himself and to be able to transform it so that people can see how he navigates even in a world of chaos and destruction. In other words, he looked deeply within the mud and he found the lotus waiting to be found. Touch deeply enough into the pain, and you'll find something within it that you can take out of it that'll be a pathway towards peace, towards love and kindness, compassion. Now, mudita is this sympathetic, vicarious joy, as it's described here. I lean a little bit more towards gratitude here, and I'll explain why. So mudita is described as releasing old habitual ways of thinking so that we can touch joy in the here and now. So remembering the things to be grateful for instead of limiting ourselves to that which we lack. The joy that comes with practicing mindfulness in community. The joy of having air conditioning in 120-degree weather. I don't think I'd be able to live here without it. In Phoenix. We're almost at 100-degree weather already. It's not even May yet. So my air conditioning's on right now, actually. So something to be grateful for, right? The joy of being able to sit here in my apartment and teach this class and not be just frying from the heat, right? In fact, there are some say that we live better now than Louis XIV did just a couple hundred years ago. We live better than kings and aristocrats from not too long ago. And it's easy to forget. But why? Why is it so easy to forget? Because it's very difficult to let go of the comparative mind. When we compare ourselves to others, particularly through social media, there's a fertile ground for jealousy to arise and envy. And that sense of lack. And perhaps even a scarcity mindset, competition. And these things are sometimes often encouraged by society because it helps perpetuate a system of consuming, right? Buy. That sense of lack drives the economy. And so that's why this Buddhist practice is so important to be able to have the freedom to even do something as radical as mindful consumption. And as Michael Stone would say, practice while you can before it's made illegal. Practice gratitude while you can before it's made illegal. With joy and gratitude, so happiness rises naturally out of that. And then lastly, upeksha, or inclusiveness, as how it's defined in our practice. Sometimes you've heard it described as equanimity. In the box there on the side says a state of balance, evenness, and objectivity, non-attachment to fondness or aversion. Again, going back to preferences, there's a strong correlation here between inclusiveness and signlessness that we talked about last week. Because once you put a label on a person or a group of people, what happens? Now we have all sorts of assumptions and a story about the kind of person they are, and the discriminating mind jumps at it. And we start to determine who is or who is not deserving of love. How difficult can it be to not take sides in a conflict? And we see it happen all the time, even with things like Ukraine and Russia, or Israel and the Palestinians, people in Gaza. Almost immediately, people jump towards taking a side. But once we remove unhelpful preferences, likes and dislikes that separate ourselves from others, now this opens up the doors for helpful conversation. Because we're no longer trapped into these labels. We start throwing around things like, oh, they're evil, right? Well, then there's no room for conversation at that point because we've already made up our minds of who they are. Recognize that all beings are the product of complex influences, not these mere labels. We find a way to connect by finding ways in which we are similar, instead of focusing on how we are different. To be confident in the belief that there's an innate goodness within all beings. As hard as that may sound, that is the practice here with Upeksha. Try to reach for the innate goodness within a human being. Even if you can't see it through their actions or on the outside, on the surface level, maybe just asking the right questions or how you show up for that person could lead to touching that goodness within them. Our happiness and suffering depend on each other. So try your best to be like the sun and shine on everybody. Moving on to the 3 jewels now. Many of you might be familiar with these already, but when we talk about taking refuge in the 3 jewels, we say, I take refuge in the Buddha, the one who shows me the way in this life. I take refuge in the Dharma, the way of understanding and love. I take refuge in the Sangha, a community that lives in harmony and awareness. So what does it mean to take refuge in the Buddha? Taking refuge means to find somewhere safe that we can rely on, right? It's our compass that guides us. And Thich Nhat Hanh compares it to a mother's womb, where we are safe from the elements of the outside world. Another way of looking at this is the guide, the path, and those who walk the path. In almost every major religion or spiritual group, there tends to be somebody who acts as the guide, somebody who's walked the path, and they're offering it to others, saying, hey, this worked for me, this might work for you too. And what the Buddha is saying is that he made a path that isn't riddled with advertisements, traffic jams, and potholes, and see if it works for you. Try it on. Try on that hat. He provides the example. Someone who is disciplined enough to be able to work on themselves, to be able to journey into their own mind, and to try to master it. So is this to say, like, it can be done, right? Because somebody had to accomplish that. And in any religion, say like in Christianity, right, we have Jesus Christ who walked the path of what we consider to be a God-fearing and God-loving, devoted to the Father. And in Islam, we had Muhammad, right? So we have several examples of these. So someone to show us the way. Verify that the path that the Buddha walked is actually applicable to your life and has the ability to cease the cycle of suffering within you. And with consistent practice, our faith in the path is not blind, nor is it a leap, but a result of our direct experience. What we mean by that is we're not encouraging people to have blind faith. So we're trying to steer clear of superstitious beliefs, more towards a personal scientific method, experimenting, see what works for you. We do not have to look outside of us for the three jewels. They are within us in every moment. The Buddha is in our mindfulness practice, the Dharma in our conscious breathing, and the Sangha is our body, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness working in harmony. So that's referencing the 5 aggregates there, which we'll get to next week, and what those mean. But the Sangha isn't just a community of people, but it's also the harmony of things happening inside of you. And what it means by the Dharma is in our conscious breathing. We're acting in accordance with the Dharma and the teachings when we actually pay attention to things as simple as the breath. And the Buddha is in our mindfulness practice because when we practice mindfulness, we are trying to walk in the same footsteps that the Buddha had walked on. And we might even take the perspective that the Buddha actually never died, but is within our own practice and in the teachings. And so when you walk in accordance with the teachings and the mindfulness practice, the Buddha walks with you. And in the Dharma, there are 84,000 Dharma doors that are claimed in the book we are reading. So finding which practices help you touch the teachings of compassion and understanding should be our aim here. And seeing which Dharma door opens up for you. And we're not saying that anybody has to choose Buddhism. That's an important distinction compared to, say, other religions. That we're not saying that everybody has to walk in the path of the Buddha. Everybody has to take these teachings, otherwise they're just lost human beings. No. But this is just something that has just happened to work for us. That's why we're here. That eliminates judgment towards others who have their own spiritual journey. And lastly, the Sangha. Thich Nhat Hanh compares this to a tiger coming down from the protection of the mountain and getting killed by humans. What does that mean? So, like, say you're in this incubator of the Sangha, right? The community of practitioners, your community of spiritual friends, which is essential to making sure that we are on the right path because they can point out blind spots that we may not see, shining a light on our personal views so that we may gain clarity on the limitations of our understanding, and in turn will help us from sinking into unwholesome habits again. And when we step out of the Sangha and into the world of busyness, now this becomes a test of whether or not we can keep our spiritual practice alive without it getting killed by the delusions of society, right? The trappings, all the trappings and the distractions. And the jewels, all three of them inter-are. So creating a harmonious community that is advancing in the practice is also caring for the Buddha and the Dharma. Right? It strengthens the teachings and the guide. Whereas correct understandings of the teachings, the Dharma, can help with the Sangha in understanding their own practice. Right? The inter-are. Can't have one without the other. And this is an important distinction to make here because some believe that they can have a spiritual practice without a community at all. And say they don't need people. Some prefer to go off into a cave somewhere and say, people suck. I don't want anything to do with them. But then what happens? Then you get stuck in your own delusions about the world and reality because you have nobody to call you out on your own BS. You start believing your own lies, basically, your own story. And you start to fall off into some other direction that sinks you into unwholesome habits. So the community is very important to keep us on the straight path. And then my question that I'm going to pose to the group is our participation in human society an obstacle to peace and harmony in our lives? Why or why not?